Good morning. It's Let's Talk Hydrogen time on this, the third day of the Dcarbonise Week Virtual Sustainability Summit. It's a pre-COP event that features stellar lineups, and that's certainly what we have here, stretching from Scotland to Western Australia. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director and co-creator of All Energy and the co-located Dcarbonise. With no in-person All Energy since 2019, we've run a compelling series of webinars, 30 between May 2020 and March of this year. Over 18,000 registered, and the webinars received over 20,000 views. Sadly, we're on the final day of All Energy's contribution to Dcarbonise Week, and delighted by the numbers of people who found time to be with us. Tomorrow, attention turns to sustainable oceans, and on Friday, sustainable travel and farming. One housekeeping point. Check out what lies behind the Resources tab. You can see what's coming up next, find a full programme link, the digital bag, and information on next May's All Energy and Dcarbonise, 11th and 12th of May. Are the dates for your diary. Naturally, we'd like to thank our sponsors. And for these first 3 days, they include our brand sponsors, Scottish Power, Shepherd and Wedderburn, Ørsted, whose names you'll see alongside certain sessions close to their hearts, and our session sponsors, Hitachi ABB Power Grids, Kellis Midstream, SSEN Transmission, SWEP, excuse me, and Driving the Electric Revolution industrialization centres. I think they must have very large business cards. And thank you for being with us today, speakers, and all of you in the audience. Over 380 of you have registered. If you enjoy the session, let us know, and also let your colleagues know they can watch on demand. Now, without more ado, I'd like to pass over to Claire Lavelle of Arup to get the show on the road. Over to you, Claire. I think you're muted.
Hello, how's that?
That's better.
Good, sorry, double muted. Thanks, Judith, and welcome everyone to Let's Talk Hydrogen. I'm Claire Lavelle. I lead Arup's energy business in Scotland, and I'm focused on the energy transition, in particular offshore wind and hydrogen. And I'm going to be your chair this morning. So discussions on the developing hydrogen economy are always wide-ranging because hydrogen has the potential to tackle decarbonisation in an incredibly diverse set of applications, and can be produced, distributed and stored in a multitude of ways in heat, transport and industry. There's wide-ranging global consensus that hydrogen's a critical part of net zero, that we're unlikely to be able to achieve our decarbonisation targets unless we can produce cost-effective low-carbon hydrogen. However, the hot topic of debate is how wide-ranging hydrogen's role will be that by the time we get to 2050. The debate is often heated, if you excuse the pun, as for some, hydrogen is seen as a distraction to acceleration of electrification. But for others, it's not only complementary to electrification, it's critical, and we won't achieve a resilient, cost-effective system without it. The discussion today is going to be focused on our short to medium term actions, so the practical steps that we need to achieve our 2030 vision. In the UK, we've less than a decade to hit our ambitious 2030 decarbonisation target of 5 gigawatt of installed low carbon hydrogen capacity. It took the UK offshore wind market just over a decade to go from the first commercial project to 5 gigawatt of installed capacity. So it's a very achievable target if we put the right things in place. However, a lot of key decisions need to be made in how we create routes to market for blue and green hydrogen production, how we even define what low carbon hydrogen is, what are the optimal applications, and how do we clear the path for deployment. So we have an eclectic panel today who are here covering a wide range of interests and roles in the hydrogen economy as producers, transporters and users at various parts of the value chain. We'll be considering the UK market, but just in case we get too parochial, we also have Sam and Russell here, who will be providing a focus on Australia and the global markets. Our speakers are going to give a really brief introduction, and we're going to leave plenty of time for a panel discussion. So please do submit your questions to the panel within the chat function. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Matthew Knight, who's Head of Market Development at Siemens Energy. So Matthew, do we have you? No. I think we've just been having some technical issues with Matthew, so I'll do an impromptu reshuffle of the programme. Barry, if it's okay, we'll ask you to go next. So Barry Carruthers, Director of Hydrogen at Scottish Power.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire. I don't envy Matthew. I know we're all kind of used to seeing kind of IT problems crop up these days, but it's still infuriating when you're on the other side of it. So hopefully Matthew does join us. I don't envy Matthew. I know we're all kind of used to seeing kind of IT. You want me to carry on, Claire?
Yeah, sorry, Barry, keep going, and we'll bring Matthew in straight after.
It's always good to follow Matthew, actually, because he usually covers about 90% of the agenda. And then
he can't steal your thunder now.
That's right. So I guess a very, very, very quick intro from me. For those that maybe don't know what Scottish Power, or in fact in the wider group Iberdrola, are doing. I mean, we are working on, certainly across UK and Ireland, about 1 gigawatts worth of pipeline projects in green hydrogen right now, and that's taken across all scales. Our headline projects are that kind of 20, 50 megawatt, but also looking up to 100 megawatt towards the end of the decade, obviously, which of course moves you into places like ammonia and LOHC. And hopefully we will have fairly significant levels of green hydrogen production end of 22, certainly by early 2023 in the UK. So I guess one of the main points hopefully we got on to discuss today for me is really about the scale and the speed at which we move at. But probably more than that, critical to where we are right now in the hydrogen sector in the UK is transparency. And by that, I mean just being really, really clear from the outset of the industry, what technologies are we using, what policy levers are at hand, how do we fund and support those schemes and those projects. But let's just be really, really clear about what we're doing, how things are categorised, just like you mentioned at the start, Claire. So for me, that's hopefully going to be a load of good discussion today on those points.
Great. No, thanks very much, Barry. Matthew, have we overcome your technology issues?
If you can hear me, then we have.
We can hear you. So, Matthew, take it away.
Okay. Well, I have some slides to go with this, so hopefully someone can show them. That's brilliant. Something's coming through. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Matthew Knight. I'm Head of Market Development at Siemens Energy in the UK. And if we can go to the first slide. Thank you. The UK government is following a twin track approach for hydrogen, both blue and green hydrogen. And I think that's right. We should do both blue and green, and we should do them well. And if we do them well, they'll both get to gigawatt scale by the end of this decade. But often when we think of twin tracks, we think of this sort of image, 2 parallel tracks going off into the distance. And if you'll just advance the slide a couple of clicks, green and blue hydrogen are more like trying to travel from London to Exeter. Just keep clicking a couple more times. Thank you. And another couple times. If you want to go from London to Exeter, there's 2 different routes, completely different routes to get there. One goes via Didcot and the other one goes via Salisbury. And they arrive at the same place, but the journey is completely different. And green and blue hydrogen are very similar in that blue, I suppose it's a bit like the sort of the nuclear industry. It's large projects, big players, huge investment decisions. Whereas the green industry is much more like solar or wind. It starts small and we do more and more projects of increasing size, but both of them can get to gigawatt scale in this country by the end of the decade, but they do need to be managed in a different way. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Often policymakers are trying to answer the big questions. How do we decarbonise these large industries with hydrogen? I would argue that as well as doing that, thank you, there's a second question we need to ask, and that's how do we grow an industry that can do that? And particularly in the case of green hydrogen, that's about starting modestly and then scaling up, speed and scale, you might say, as fast as we can. So next slide, please. And that is recognised in the UK government's hydrogen roadmap, which came out in August, and I would highly recommend the hydrogen strategy to anyone who hasn't read it yet, and particularly this roadmap, which sets out that while we're building the mega scale blue hydrogen projects, investment decisions in 2 or 3 years time and on stream from the sort of 2027 onwards, while we're doing that, we also need to build a green hydrogen industry, starting with 10, 20 megawatt projects and building all the way up to gigawatt scale offshore wind to hydrogen projects at the end of the decade. Next slide, please. What we've seen so far is lots of policy that supports the later parts of that ramp up, but my contention is that there's still something missing to get us going at an early step. And if you click the next one, I'll try and explain that. So the industry as we understand it today is quite small scale. We have a number of electrolyzers making hydrogen for small scale transport refueling projects. And that needs to grow through fleets of things like buses and trains and big construction equipment, and industries that can move to hydrogen early. And we know there's a number of those that are already interested in this, things like whiskey distilling or green tourism. And that will then move up through increasing size projects connected to renewable sites around the country, and eventually to large-scale offshore wind farms. And we've seen in the bids for the recent ScotWind leasing round that people are considering things up to sort of 500 megawatts of hydrogen as part of their proposal for a large offshore wind farm. So there's no shortcut. We've got to go through all of those stepping stones. The support that we have for that at the moment, if you click the next slide, and click again, and we'll get all of this in place. So at the low level, we've got the renewable transport fuel obligation funding, which provides some revenue support for small scale transport related projects. But there are various people trying, and it's quite difficult to scale that up much above the 1 megawatt scale. And from 2023 onwards, we're going to have the new hydrogen business model, for which there's a consultation at the moment. That was originally designed for large-scale blue hydrogen. Bayes would argue that it's also applicable to green hydrogen and even smaller green hydrogen. But we've got potentially 2 policy gaps there. We've got one for the urgent need to build something in the next couple of years to get the supply chain started. And potentially, if the business model isn't suitable for smaller projects, we might have an ongoing need for something there. So if you click once more, please. If we can get the policy right, and we do get the industry going, the supply chain is ready to scale up. And this is a picture from our factory that makes electrolyzers in Germany. And you can see it's already a semi-automated process, and gigafactories making these things in huge quantities are just around the corner when the market appears. And I'll stop there.
Excellent, Matthew. That was fantastic, and a lovely metaphor as well. I can see we've already got some questions through in the chat around supply chain, so I look forward to picking up with you in the Q&A around those economic opportunities. But I think for now, I'm going to hand over to Sam Lee Mohan, who is Head of Strategy at Exodus. So, Sam.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction, and to All Energy, as well as the Government of Western Australia European Office, for the opportunity to join the discussion today. So actually following on from what Matthew was talking about, which I thought was very, very relevant in the discussion happening today, when you look at a macro view of hydrogen, today around 120 million tons of hydrogen is produced globally each year, of which 2/3 is pure hydrogen, not green, pure hydrogen, and 1/3 is mixed with other gases. And when you consider that around 95% of all hydrogen is generated from natural gas and coal, and around 5% generated from chlorine products using through electrolysis. Now, when you put that in a European Union context, the EU is currently using approximately 9.7 million tons of hydrogen annually, which needs decarbonizing by 2030. Which needs decarbonizing by 2050. But by 2030, hydrogen demand under the EU's ambitious target is set to ramp up to around 16.9 million tons per annum. Now, when you consider the existing hydrogen usage and the cross-sector potential of hydrogen, the scene is really set for hydrogen to play a crucial role in the UK and Australia's efforts to decarbonize by 2050. From a cross-sector perspective, capability perspective, hydrogen will be critical in achieving deep decarbonization of heat, which you'll hear from my ex-colleague Russell in a few moments about how that practically plays out. And also transport, industrial, power sectors, but committed policy, as Matthew was talking about, committed policy, public and private sector investments and technology advancements will be critical in achieving the scale of deployment and reducing costs. So very quickly, let's look at the government's, the UK government's policy in achieving the targets. Now, we obviously don't have a lot of time to go through it in detail, and I'm sure there's many other people that can speak much more in detail of this. But when you consider the part of the UK's 10-point plan for green industrial revolution, 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production, green or blue hydrogen by 2030, is roughly around 730,000 tons or 0.73 million tons per annum, which is about 7.5% of that 9.7 million tons in the EU being consumed. So it's actually very achievable target. From an Australian perspective, when you consider the Australian National Hydrogen Strategy, which identified 57 actions, these actions cut right across in relation to export, transport, industrial use, gas networks, electricity systems, and cross-cutting issues, which is fundamental for us to scale up in terms of safety, skills, and environmental impacts. In Australia today, there are 16 projects that are either in operation or under construction, with a further 13 in advanced stages of development planning. So in a West Australian, bringing that right down to a West Australian context, 17% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions comes from Western Australia. And with its population only accounting for around 10%, green hydrogen will actually play a significant role in decarbonization journey, particularly when you consider the abundance of world-class renewable resources that we have, wind, solar, wave, etc. And when you consider West Australia is the second largest LNG exporter globally, we have an export capacity of more than 40 million tons per annum. Renewable hydrogen exports can leverage off existing LNG industry in terms of transferable skills, established supply chains, expertise in building world-class energy export industries. The WA government has already set a goal to approve at least one renewable hydrogen export project by 2022 and to build up its market share in global hydrogen exports equal to the current LNG market share by 2030. So again, a very ambitious but doable targets. So if I can just conclude in terms of, one of those challenges is going to be that economic challenge, the energy trilemma. So while industries move forward with deployment scale projects, incumbent fuels occupy healthy competitive positions. So looking at the commercialization pathways, one such pathway is co-located onshore and offshore hydrogen production systems. The offshore environment offers a great opportunity to tap into a more powerful and consistent wind resource. And green hydrogen offers a promising pathway to commercialization, especially if produced co-located onshore and offshore to avoid curtailment, high costs, limited power losses on cable transmissions. And here in Australia, with support from government, we're seeing green hydrogen being produced, under $6 a kilogram, down from $21 a kilogram in 2019. So the three main levers for me in achieving achieving cost parity is energy input price that will continue to fall as more renewables enter the market, capex reduction, and technology efficiency, the three pillars, which the latter, capex and technology, will be significantly improved with scale. And I'll leave it there. Claire, back to you.
Oh, Sam, that was great. Really helpful getting the scale of context, not just at a UK side, but put in a European and global market as well. So really interesting. And I'm definitely keen to explore a little bit later. I think everyone's after that green economic recovery opportunity. So, how do you build an indigenous market and a supply chain that creates an export market? But not every country is going to be able to do that, and so I think it'd be good to explore with you a little bit later about what's Australia's unique position and what's the UK and what should we be targeting. But before we get to that, I'm just going to hand over to Russell James, who is General Business Development Manager at APCO Australia.
Thanks very much, Claire. So I do have a couple of slides to discuss today, and I think I was just going to set some context around what APCO are doing, particularly in Western Australia. So, Matthew touched on building these projects up when it comes to green. When you see the blue projects, they're the mega scale projects today, which are more focused around CCS and how to resolve the CCS issue in Western Australia. But APCO have predominantly been focused in building scale and expertise and capability over the years. So APCO are a global organisation. We build modular structures. We also have a lot of power station assets and electricity transmission and distribution and generation, but also we have a lot of gas processing, storage, distribution and transmission assets. And that's what's led us to really start to look at what hydrogen can and play into the future energy mix, and particularly in relation to our network assets. So if you jump onto the next slide, please. So this is a little bit about our roadmap in Western Australia. So as Sam touched on before, the Western Australian government set about a hydrogen strategy in 2019, which set 4 pillars of goals around items that were wanting to be achieved by 2022 and also by 2030, which really was about setting this industry up and this emerging industry up for what WA could contribute on a global scale in future, with a real goal that a hydrogen export market emulates what our LNG market did back in the 80s when we started that industry in exporting energy to other countries and assisting them to further decarbonise. So APCO have been involved in a number of projects which I'll touch through, including a small-scale production facility, and then recognising that we've got very low-cost gas here in Western Australia, but some of the adjacent markets, such as transportation and stationary power and diesel displacement in our remote locations that we have. WA is a very sparse, resource-rich country, and so there's a lot of diesel that gets trucked around to different locations for use on remote mines and communities as well. And hydrogen has a great opportunity to play in that. And then building up into sort of commercial scale projects, we're looking at building a 10 megawatt facility, and then even further into taking into export scale projects. And there's a couple of cluster locations around the state that are looking really viable to get world-class renewables into an export model for hydrogen. So with that, APCO's hydrogen journey, if you jump on the next slide, this is just a snapshot of some of the projects that we've got on the go. So we are, as I said, touched on building a 10 megawatt facility, and we're looking at to take FID of that next year. We are looking to blend into the gas distribution network. We are blending 10% at our Jandakot Operations Centre today, and we're also utilising that to take that opportunity further outside to our other networks. So what we were doing here in Western Australia, we're also replicating over in California, and then also back in Canada with some of our network injections. And we have got the first commercial fleet of hydrogen vehicles here in Western Australia, a fleet of 15 Toyota Mirais that we're working on a refuelling station currently. So on to the next slide. This is a bit of a pictograph of our operations centre, where we installed and essentially emulated what we find here in the Western Australian electricity market. We installed more solar panels than we could possibly need. In Western Australia, everybody has solar panels on their roofs, and what that's doing is exporting power out to the grid, and it's causing massive grid stability issues when there's not the demand during the day. And so what we were trying to demonstrate is the ability for hydrogen to capture that spilled renewable and store that, essentially, that can be used at those peak times when people are coming home and using their gas appliances, such as heating and cooking. So in Western Australia, gas appliances are tested up to 13% hydrogen content. And so we're currently we're blending at 10%. Downstream of our meter within appliances such as gas-powered air conditioning, heating, cooking, and the like, and even reciprocating engines and micro turbines. We do have a small hybrid home, which essentially looks like a residential home that you find out on the network, and we have integrated a fuel cell into that home as well to demonstrate what a home might look like in the future. So this site's been operational for around 2 years, and has been blending it at that rate since then. On to the next slide. We did have some additional hydrogen capability and availability at that site. So when I talked about unlocking these other markets, we do have very low cost gas, natural gas here in the state. And so diesel displacement or petrol displacement was something that we saw as a really active market. But we wanted to resolve the chicken or egg issue, which everybody always talks about. Where can I get hydrogen from? Where can I fill a vehicle up from? Well, we had hydrogen. The next step was to install a refueling point that would give access to vehicles, and also be able to demonstrate to people that this isn't a science experiment. This is not something that's way into the future. These vehicles are available today. Obviously, there still needs to be a lot of work to build the scale and to get the number of vehicles into the state. And we really see that heavy haulage has a great opportunity here. The sparse distances around our state, we have a lot of trucks and buses that are rolling around the roads, but even that can focus into rail transportation and then further into shipping and bunkering fuel as well. So we will be commissioning this late this year or early next year, and it's a fast fill configuration. So we can fill one of these Toyota Mirais that can travel about 500 to 600 kilometres on one fill in about 3 to 5 minutes. And so the energy density and storage capability, particularly when it gets into heavy haulage, where you're not able to put enough batteries into a vehicle to cart it that far, we see hydrogen as a great step. On to the next slide. We have just recently been awarded $2 million from the state government to commence a further blending project to take renewable hydrogen produced at our Dcarbonise facility out to 2,500 homes around the area. And that piece of work will also take into account the technical, the economic, and also the regulatory and legislation requirements that are needed to be changed. In Australia, the national gas law is being expedited to be amended to allow hydrogen to be injected into networks, and that work's aimed to be completed by the end of next year. But there are sort of 140 bits of legislation to wade through as well to enable that to occur. So hence, this is an important step to get up the safety case going and the acceptance and proving up of the ability to do that into networks on a broader scale. And the last slide I'll just cover quickly. The Australian Renewable Energy Agency ran a funding round around commercial scale projects. So this is really to try and build scale and bring the cost down. So capital efficiency of electrolyzers and building scale. And we're really excited that we were one of the 3 projects selected from 36 to take forward on a 10 megawatt facility that'll be co-located with a wind farm with a really high capacity factor slightly north of Perth. So we'll produce around 4 tonnes of hydrogen a day, and we're actually going to be compressing and trucking that to potential customers in either the transportation sector, remote power, but also, more importantly, network injections into gas networks in the Perth region. So I'll probably stop there and people can ask questions about some of those things and what Western Australia is doing.
Great, Russell. Thanks for that, and that was really interesting. Good to see the parallels actually from the UK and Australia, but both energy rich nations with and excess of renewables, and how we most get the benefit of that. And certainly looking at, parallels between the work that Scottish Power are doing at Whiteley, looking at solar and wind and transport applications. We're actually working with SGN in the UK on a hydrogen for heating project in Scotland as well. So some very similar parallel track activities between what we're doing across the nations. And so maybe I'd like to come back to that question. So we're all kind of chasing this silver bullet that we can decarbonize our economies, and we've got a just transition. So, we do it at low cost, but we also grow our economic activity and create jobs. And I guess for me, the real challenge is targeting our investment. So I think we can't all be everything to everyone. We can't all build indigenous export industries across every part of the hydrogen supply chain. So I'm kind of keen to ask the panel what their view, so, for their respective nations and parts of the global economy, where do we really see that, our kind of differentiator, our skill is, and so where should we be really investing in building that supply chain? So Matthew, I might start with you on that one, just because I think you've got probably quite a global outlook on that, but I think I'll put that to the rest of the panel as well to take a bit more of a UK Australian view on that.
Well, the first thing to say is this is genuinely a race. I mean, it's a race against time for the planet, but it's also a race between countries to capture at least their fair share of the supply chain. And what we've seen from other technologies in the past, the classic example is if you look at the wind industry, Denmark is the place with more wind turbine factories than anywhere else. And that wasn't because it was the largest market in the world, but it was the market that got going first, that delivered a visible pipeline of work that the supply chain could then start investing to supply. And that's absolutely crucial. So whatever advantages or disadvantages countries have in terms of natural resources or existing skills or other things, it's really crucial that everybody who's trying to promote hydrogen in that country helps to create that pipeline of work, because that's what allows the supply chain to invest. If you don't have that, then throwing sort of government money at R&D or inward investment stuff, it might bring some results, but it's not going to perform. But if you get everything working together, the industry will start investing its own money and training its own people. So it's all about the pipeline of work. The UK does have some structural advantages. When it comes to blue hydrogen, we have the place to put carbon dioxide underneath the North Sea. We have an existing oil and gas industry. We have a large number of big engineering consulting firms. We've got everything we need to be able to do blue hydrogen at scale. And we are the sort of the home territory of some of the independent oil companies who are interested in getting into this. So I think we've got lots of things there. We also have the City of London. Finance is international, but a lot of the people who are investing in this space are based in London, and so local projects are particularly visible and particularly easy for them. When it comes to green hydrogen, our big opportunity is going to be offshore wind. We have Europe's largest renewable resource surrounding our country, and we've driven the cost right down, and that's the kind of the prize at the end of the day. But going back to my first point, just because one day we might be the biggest market with the largest amount of low-cost renewable energy for making hydrogen doesn't mean we get the supply chain unless we start building those small, medium-sized projects now and start building a supply chain here. Because once people invest in a factory somewhere or building a team of people somewhere, that's where they're going to go on growing. And this industry's got to grow 3 orders of magnitude this decade So it really matters where it gets going first.
No, that's a really good point, and I think a kind of key message in the UK's hydrogen business model engagement, unless we invest now in growing that market across both blue and green, we're not really going to capture the supply chain. So it can't be a wait and see, can it? And expect that we're going to maximise the economic benefits.
Yeah.
Russell and then Sam, it would be good to get the Australian outlook on that. Where do you see your Indigenous skill strengths are? Where should the investment go?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's still a bit of a play on green versus blue here in Australia. There's a really strong focus on the green opportunity, given a land mass, great solar resource, really good wind resource as well that can be co-located, and then the existing, I think Sam touched on it, the existing supply and trade routes that exist today with the certain off-takers such as Japan and South Korea who are pointing towards 2050 decarbonisation. So I think there's the element of that. Where I often come back to is what is the customer wanting to take? So is it hydrogen? Is it ammonia? Is it blue? Is it green? And let that kind of drive the decision. Now, I don't think even that's been completely resolved. So then it comes down to, is it cost? Now, I think Matthew had a good point around structurally as well. We haven't got a huge amount of CCS projects here in Australia that have currently got up, but there is a lot of interest and investment that are starting to occur even from a federal level. There's been an allowance now by the Australian Renewable Energy Agency to include CCS as part of their remit, where it wasn't previously. So there's a bit of a change in shift around thinking on that. From an ATCO perspective, in Canada, we've got a lot of experience in salt caverns and the like. So there's a more focus on really low cost. You get negative gas pricing over in Canada. So the ability to use that for blue hydrogen production and storage into an export market is probably where ATCO is looking. In Australia, we are probably more focused in the green space at this point in time. Something that's really important as well that I think to point out is around certification schemes and global certification schemes as we get into customer needs. Like how do you track the electron or the molecule or the carbon capture that certifies that hydrogen to be of a certain standard? And that'll be an important part on a world global trading mechanism, rather than each country, I suppose, going for their own certification schemes and then trying to trade that on a global basis. So yeah, Sam, I suppose it's to you.
Yeah, it's really good context, Ross. And I suppose if I can just take a step back in terms of what Australia and the UK to a large extent is doing, I think the plan is actually sensible to date. Pilot scale projects, as Ross mentioned, we've done pilot scale projects. There's pilot scale projects over in the UK. There's significant amount of learnings from a technology, from an integration, from a regulatory perspective that we learn. And now we're at the, hedging into moving quite swiftly into deployment scale, where, there's a step change from pilot to deployment. And governments have been injecting capital into these projects. And what we're seeing is when you look at the cost of producing a kilogram of hydrogen, capital is less than 25%. A lot of it is in the cost of energy. So the investment has been to a large extent, really focused at the right levels. But in order for us to get another step change and move into the industrial scale, this is where mechanisms like contract for difference, like green certifications, are going to play fundamental roles, and governments need to be working with private sector to get the right policy signals to enable private sector to continue investing. I mean, when you consider the UK alone, 9 utility organizations all formed a consortium to decarbonize the gas pipelines, but also invest in, I think it's about 6,800 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline through the EU. These are significant signposts, and governments really need to start moving policy. As Russ mentioned, there's $100 140 pieces of legislation that needs to be reviewed before we can actually start moving into the next scale. And just touching on Marston's point, on Matthew's point, that we really have to be thinking about scaling quickly, because this is a race. From an export perspective, it's definitely a race. From a decarbonization perspective, it's a race. And the steps we're taking towards that is sensible steps. We do have the engineering, the massive engineering houses. We have private sector that's innovating across the value chain to provide knowledge and sharing, etc. So from my perspective, I think that governments are focusing probably correctly for pilot deployment, but now we need to shift gears and really start thinking about scale and industrial scale as we head towards achieving 2030 targets.
Great. And Barry, I did want to explore a little bit some of the comments that you made around transparency and low carbon hydrogen standards. I can give you a quick opportunity if you wanted to respond on that kind of skills supply chain point, but I think it would be really good to have you elaborate a little bit on your views on what makes for low and zero carbon and where we should set the standard.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not that much to add to what the guys have already covered in terms of the skills piece, other than to say, I mean, the UK is becoming a green career type country. We do have a really strong renewables focus, energy infrastructure. We are good at that stuff. So I think that does give us a good basis for growing this sector particularly. And yeah, the transparency point for me is just critical because, I think you mentioned it, Russell, it's actually a pretty unhealthy conversation sometimes to get into blue versus green. And even just on a personal level, I just can't be bothered with that. But I think what we can do is be clear, both for investors and people who are going to build projects, but probably more so for the end user, for the customer. We can't have, undistinguished forms of molecules or unclear certification, because ultimately it will come back to bite us as a sector. And I say that because, we distinguish between the emissions of hybrid cars and fully electric cars, for example. Now, we even distinguish in the electricity sector between ways of creating electricity which is fossil fuel based and renewable electricity. But then within renewable electricity, we distinguish between forms of creating renewable electricity. They have different policy levers, they have different funding pots. We appreciate that solar is different from offshore wind. So they have different policy mechanisms, they have different funding schemes, and that's just for clean electricity. So if we go too quickly, too far to just say, there's such an umbrella term, for example, called low carbon hydrogen, and everything underneath that umbrella is okay, then that's going to come back to bite us. So all I think is right now we've got all the consultations out, we're forming the sector, particularly in the UK, on the back of the strategy. That transparency will serve us well in the future. If we are then looking at industrial customers, transportation applications, where they might not necessarily know that they're asking for blue or for green. And we've had conversations like this with people, organisations in private sector who do want to decarbonise. They know that hydrogen molecule is potentially of value to them, and they won't fully understand blue or green unless you sit down and explain it to them. So that kind of capturing the carbon intensity grading and then making sure that we're incentivising the right behaviours, that's kind of what I mean by transparency. But I think because the consultations are out right now, this is the moment to kind of set that tone and set those gradings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good point, Barry, because I think even within green and within blue, that there's going to be different carbon intensity, and we can set a business model that incentivize lowest cost, but we've really got to be able to count the cost of that carbon as well, don't we? Because ultimately we're going to have to offset any residual emissions that we get to by 2050, and there's a cost of that, and there's a cost of not offsetting them. So that is absolutely critical that we tackle that. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in quickly on that point. There's some good questions coming through in the Q&A that I'm keen to pick up. No, good. So maybe just to look to the Q&A, I've got one from Chris Pemberton, who wants to know what confidence the panel has in carbon capture and storage for blue hydrogen. So I'm not sure if anyone would like to. Matthew, would you hand up, Matthew?
Yep. Carbon capture and storage works, and it's not just for hydrogen. We're going to need carbon capture and storage to decarbonise other industries, things like cement, which you just can't make without it evolving carbon dioxide as a byproduct of the chemical reaction. So the main reason for doing carbon capture and storage is about decarbonising industry. And if you've got the carbon stores and you've got the carbon pipelines, then making hydrogen that way is a sensible thing to do. But blue hydrogen made with carbon capture and storage is only really helping us if it's done right. We have to make sure that we get the fugitive emissions right. So that's the upstream part of getting the feedstock. And there's not a kind of a free pass for the oil and gas industry to make blue hydrogen. We have to get low emission production of the gas and then very high capture rates in the process. And ultimately, not now, not in 10 years, not in 50 years, but if we're producing hydrogen today with fossil fuel that has been buried in the ground for the last 65 million years, when we burn that hydrogen, we are going to release water vapor, and that's going to be new water vapor that isn't in the atmosphere at the moment. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so it's in terms of the sort of the quantities and everything else, it's much less significant and damaging than the carbon dioxide or the methane, but ultimately it's not in the long run, it's not a sustainable thing to do. But the benefits that we can get from switching away from fossil fuels onto blue hydrogen far outweigh the further footprint that blue hydrogen has. So it's part of the story, but only if it's done well. And equally, green doesn't get a free ride. You've got to be making green hydrogen efficiently using renewable energy and not diverting renewable energy that you would have decarbonized something else with into making hydrogen when that's not the right thing to do. So hydrogen is, as with everything, part of a whole set of things we need to do to get to net zero and to decarbonize. It's great for some things, it's all right for other things, it's pretty rubbish for other things. And if any of you have seen the Michael Liebreich ladder, that's a good way of characterizing the sorts of things that hydrogen is best for. But it's certainly doable, and if it's going to play its part, we need to be making gigatons of the stuff by the end of this decade.
Great. No, Matthew, that's a good point. It's the right projects in the right places is absolutely critical to maintaining confidence in the industry. So I've got an interesting conversation from Sonia Martins from SWECO in the chat on what is the current lead time for a 20 megawatt electrolyzer. I might broaden that out a little bit as well, because we've got a bunch of people here that are buying and selling electrolyzers. I'd be keen to have a bit of a discussion around the capacity of the supply chain to scale up to meet the target. So, we're obviously at the bottom of that kind of exponential growth in a market, and how confident and comfortable are we that the supply chain are going to be able to respond to that opportunity, and that won't become a barrier, because I'm sure we can speak to some relatively long lead times for electrolyzers that the market is seeing at the minute.
Yes. Shall I respond to that?
You go first, Matthew.
Okay. Well, the first thing to say is right now, if you've got any green hydrogen available, there's a bunch of people who'll bite your arm off to get it. We are very short of supply of green hydrogen. About 90% of all the green hydrogen that's being used in this country at the moment is being used by Andrew Cunningham and his firm GeoPura, and he can't get enough of the stuff. So in the short term, we're desperately short, but we're talking there kilograms, a few multi-cylinder pack here's, the odd tube trailer. That is 1,000 times smaller than we need to get to before the end of the decade. The lead time for an electrolyzer is at the moment around about 18 months. If you're looking at sort of from order received to having it on site and humming, the lead time for the compression to go with it is actually slightly longer. So if you talk about sort of 2 years from an investment decision to having a hydrogen system up and running, that's probably a reasonable assumption. The lead times can and will get faster, but it's going to be a function of the industry scaling up. And I'm sure there will be times when lead times are long, and there'll be times when you can get one off the shelf. But that's just going to be the growing pains of an industry. But when we look at the hydrogen industry as it is today, it's a shadow of what the hydrogen industry will be even in 2 years' time. So I don't think we should read anything into shortages or lead times today in the longer run.
Great. But Barry, was that a hand up?
It was a kind of casual hand up. I'm not used to not having my Teams button where I put up my formal hand up like I'm in school.
You've no yellow hand.
Yeah, that's it. And I guess only to add on, I mean, compression was the thing I was going to add as well to Matthew's note. But even just as Matthew says, that's kind of from your point of order. As you know very well, Claire, yourself, it's where are you going to put it? So you really have to have been thinking about your grid connections, your environmental consents. I mean, in the UK, we've got a 20 megawatt application going through planning consent process just now. And I mean, they're not straightforward, obviously, because it's new to many people, not least planners, and also all your other stakeholders as well to bring on the journey with you. So I think it's fair to say we are kind of pushing the supply chain to deliver as fast as possible. But that's kind of why you need to get a pipeline up and spinning, like Matthew says, because if you are going to make those big order decisions and start writing checks at the start of 2022, for example, you probably have done 6 to 12 months work easily before then. And therefore, to get to, say, 50 or 100 megawatts worth of deployments in the next couple of years, actually, you have to have a couple of 100 megawatts in your pipeline right here today as well. So it is the front end of work as well that we should be thinking about as an industry, which is absolutely why we're talking about speed of movement right now.
Yeah, no, it's good point, isn't it? And it's one thing having a target, isn't it? There's another thing actually having a plan for delivery, and it's the plan that you need to be able to make sure that supply chain can invest. And I always think that, we delivered 5 gigawatt of offshore wind in a decade, but we'd a very mature supply chain for wind turbines to respond to that. And so, we need to be able to give the confidence to that supply chain of electrolyzers that capacity is coming and being delivered. Yeah, so please do, Sam.
Just very quickly. In terms of electrolyzer lead times, it's really interesting as well, and it's great to hear from Matthew on that. But the way we like to think about it, having practically delivered these projects, is there's balance of plant around the black box of the electrolyzer, and then there's balance of plant outside of the battery limits of the electrolyzer. So when we consider all of these balance of plant that goes around the electrolyzer, it's fundamental at the early design stage to really understand what it is you're actually ordering from. What's actually your scope that the OEM is going to be providing. Does it include the transformers? Does it include compression, as Barry was talking about? Does it include the inverters, etc.? And then how does it actually connect to your balancer plant outside of it? So getting these things upfront correct in your design is fundamental, and that will significantly improve the lead time. And what we're seeing is that it's important to start working with OEMs upfront. So there's lots of knowledge gaps in terms of integration of these systems. And the more upfront you're working with your OEMs, the easier it's going to be to actually integrate it and make sure we got, dew point monitors, for example, built into your systems.
Great.
All impact lead time.
No, thanks, Sam. So I've got a question here from David Cronin, which I think Russell would be good to get your view on, but I'm sure that Barry will weigh in. So he said, with an increasing renewables on the grids, there could be increasing electricity curtailment. How could hydrogen make best use of curtailed energy? So I know Russell, you kind of touched on the challenges with solar energy in Australia. Barry will be no stranger to the similar challenges with wind in the UK. So keen to hear your view on hydrogen's role in constrained renewables.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's one that the whole energy market is grappling with. And I think we talk a little bit more around hydrogen as a storage mechanism rather than as an energy source. It's your ability to store excess renewables. I think Matthew had the same point. If that electron could have gone somewhere else, that might have been a better way to use it. So that spilled renewable is something that's really important. So I think I touched on before, about 30 to 40% of households have solar on their rooftops here in Western Australia. And so you can imagine it's school holidays, everybody's on, down south, not in their homes. And the grid here will get to the point where it's almost blackout. And so there's new market developments in around grid stability payments and things like frequency control, which actually helps to better the economics around hydrogen. So if you can, you can take a power price that's very low and also provide an ancillary service to the network operator and then store that hydrogen, you're adding to the value chain along the way. So we see that really coming into play, and they call it the duck curve here, in the energy and energy market, and that's going to continue to get worse and worse over time. So that'll continue to help hydrogen's economics come online. And so I think, it's a really important part to play in. How does that integrate, even at a substation level? How can electrolyzers be placed around the electricity network to better that? The challenge today is where you grid connect some of these projects and have to pay transmission and distribution charges. It really hurts the economics around hydrogen. So there needs to be further work around how there can be concessions or other markets that hydrogen can tap into in terms of those payments. So yeah, on to you, Barry.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few steps in the logic for us on this one, where if you're starting off with electrons, sticking with the electrons throughout the chain is always the wisest thing to do. So that's why you see us deploying battery storage, of course, and a bit different, horses for courses. It's not long-term storage. It's about responding to grid signals and these things. So that makes sense because you're not having conversion losses every time you got hydrogen, obviously. I think there's also a wee bit of kind of myth busting to be done in terms of curtailment of energy suddenly becoming free, for example, which simply is not the case. And then the third thing really is, for us, when we are looking to produce hydrogen, it's for a purpose, it's for a customer, it's for someone who needs that, and therefore I don't envisage the case, for example, where we have electrolyzers sitting quietly waiting for a curtailment period, because you've got a multi-million-pound asset there hoping for some kind of curtailment event. We would be building business cases on the basis that we've either built new solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, to then feed that electrolyzer to then produce the hydrogen for a need. So it sounds like absolutely conceptually, I think everybody gets it, that there must be benefits hidden in there somewhere. As I say, I do think there is a kind of 3 or 4 step, at least, logic to work through before you get there. Because as we've worked through it, as you'd imagine in our company, it's really not as obvious as the concept might feel.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and maybe there's a bit of a simplified debate on this, but I definitely think hydrogen is a friend of increasing electrification, and we are going to have significantly more challenges in the future in terms of how we actually build a resilient system. But it's not as simple as hydrogen's a straight storage medium, because that's not particularly efficient. But actually, when we've just got a diverse system that's got molecules and electrons, that puts us in a much better position, doesn't it? So I've got a question from Waleed Cheetah from Siemens Energy around electrolysis and seawater. And Sam, I wondered that you might want to pick that up. So is there electrolysis that can handle seawater directly? Or are we going to have to apply water treatment to use for electrolysis?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and there's actually quite a bit of advancement in technologies that use direct seawater, salt water into electrolysis. Solid oxide technology is advancing quite rapidly as well. But in terms of water in the more general context, when we get up to the scales that we are talking about, we're really moving into an area of desalination to provide that water into electrolysis. And reverse osmosis deionization systems are actually quite mature technology. So I think there is advancements in direct saltwater usage, but at the same time, when we're talking about the scale we're talking about, these systems generally feed off, or will be feeding off, desalination plants, of which then has another business case, which is to supply our domestic requirement for drinking water, potable water as well. So yeah, to answer the question or summarize it, significant advancements in direct salt water for electrolysis, but at the same time, there is very mature technology in desalination to provide the water that's required for scale we're talking about.
Great. No, thanks, Sam. So watch this space in terms of technology coming. So I I kind of love the Q&A in a hydrogen discussion, because it always goes from the deeply technical to the macroeconomic one. So just to change up the pace a little bit, I've got a question from John McLean, who's asking about developed country versus developing country, and economic benefit going to assist third world countries to have their fair share in the new future. So how do we ensure a just transition and a global just transition while we are transitioning to a green economy? Anyone brave enough to tackle the big scale? Barry's got his hand up. He's game.
Yeah, I think because because we have the Iberdrola context, which we're part of, so we do actually have that global view of different countries that we operate in. And I guess first port of call for this is electrification, because we have a program called Electricity for All, for example, which is about trying to expand electrical infrastructure and renewable electricity to rural areas across Brazil. Now, that's because that, as we all know, is just the most energy efficient way to do it. And so even for example, the growth of green hydrogen as a deployment method of green fuels and green energy for other countries, you're still going to need energy infrastructure. You're still going to need electrical infrastructure to even connect those electrolyzers, and of course renewable electricity to then feed the electrolyzers. So whilst absolutely there could and should be benefits, because of course we know that many developing countries will still rely on fossil fuels and maybe import fuel oil, for example. So when you start to think of electrical infrastructure as a basis, it then unlocks the opportunities for green hydrogen. So I mean, that sounds very obvious that we would say that. Of course we would say that, but I think it does hold true that if you're building renewable energy to create electricity, you're creating electrical infrastructure, that then unlocks opportunities to have more of a green hydrogen opportunity for these countries as well.
Great. Anybody else want to speak to that? Oh, Matthew.
I'd just like to compare with the system that we have at the moment. some countries have natural resources and other countries don't. So we have an unfair and unbalanced world at the moment. The nice thing about hydrogen is it has so many uses, and there are so many different sources of energy that you can make it with, that it's almost inevitably going to be more distributed and more fairly distributed around the world than the sort of the fossil-based economy that we have at the moment. And hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen, like ammonia, are a good way of bringing energy to remote places that doesn't involve fossil fuel. So I think as the hydrogen economy develops, yes, some places will get the factories and other places won't get the factories, but the fact that it will be used locally, and it will be improving air quality locally, and it will be creating energy and taking people out of darkness locally, the hydrogen economy is going to be more fair than what we have now.
Yeah, no, good point, Matthew. And when we look at the balance of an economy that was hydrocarbon based to one that's renewable based, net zero means that not everyone's going to be able to fulfill all their needs with their indigenous supply, and there'll be some different winners, won't there, in those that can produce hydrogen cheaply and get it to other markets. And particularly low cost solar creates a large economic opportunity for those that can produce this. I've got a question around boilers, and is there work being done to eliminate nitrous oxide emissions from the use of hydrogen boilers? Russell, I wondered that you might want to speak to this one.
Yeah, there is some work ongoing with that. I suppose there's a couple of parts. We're doing more testing around blending with existing operations. So we're not seeing issues around NOx with the current blend levels that we're doing, but of course the appliances are tested up to 13%, so they're within limits that are okay. When we get into 100% appliances, that's really where NOx challenges start to step in, and some of that comes to even what you're using it for. If you're using it in a reciprocating engine or a turbine, of which some of the things we're doing, the issue comes to the efficiency of the flame and the blending and combustion chamber. So where you get that optimized, the NOx isn't an issue. Where it is a challenge is where you don't get optimized flame combustion, and that attracts more of the nitrogen in with the oxygen, and you're getting the NOx emissions. So the important part is really getting these efficient appliances, and there's a lot of work happening, particularly in the UK is leading a lot of this space with some of the appliance manufacturers that are looking at 100% boilers. And there's been one installed by NGN in the home currently today, so that's installed inside. So I think there's enough work in that space that we can conquer that challenge.
Great. No, thanks, Russell. And actually, we're doing some really interesting work for UK government in the High for Heat programme, looking at development of domestic appliances. There's some really positive stuff coming out of the trials of those appliances, just in terms of ensuring that NOx are minimised. So we're kind of getting near to the end of the session, and so I was just going to use speaker's prerogative to ask my own question and deviate a bit from the Q&A for the moment. I just wanted to end a little bit on consumers. So we're kind of often guilty as as kind of engineers and industry experts in terms of focusing on how we deliver infrastructure and projects, somewhat a little remote from the end users, and keen to hear from the panel a little bit on what they see the role of consumers in the energy transition. So are we going to be really able to enable consumer choices? Are we going to be able to give people a kind of open menu of different decarbonisation solutions? Are we doing enough to engage and inform and enthuse domestic, commercial and industrial users, across all of the end uses? So keen to get someone to tackle that in our closing 5 minutes. Any?
I can start on that.
Yep, please do, Sam.
Yeah, it's really important and cannot be underestimated or even overestimated for that matter, just the role of social licensing is going to play in this. There's two aspects to it. One, it's the social license to operate as we go ahead and build these systems, which, the pilot and deployment scale where you can see it, touch it, feel it, it's safe, we can safely produce it, store it, use it, etc. Fundamental to perception. But more importantly, in terms of consumer choice, interestingly, Exodus was at a manufacturing facility yesterday, and the manufacturer is currently using rooftop solar to decarbonize his manufacturing facility, of which only 25% is now decarbonized with solar, and he's looking at hydrogen to actually turn the tables and get 75% decarbonization. And then it came back down to the energy trilemma of sustainability, reliability, and affordability. So, on which end of that spectrum, affordability just went right up to the top in terms of, I want to decarbonize, but at the same time, is it affordable for me to do that? How does that impact my customers, etc.? So they are going to actually decide, where billions is going to be spent, because as Barry was saying, we're not going to build these systems to just sit dormant. It's going to be very customer focused. Customer will drive the demand and actually decide where billions is going to be spent in the supply chain.
Great. No, that's a good point. And Barry, I think you had your.
Yeah, it's our daily kind of bread and butter is having these conversations with, both domestic customers, obviously, as wider Scottish Power, but specifically in the hydrogen space with industrial customers and public sector. So I think on a domestic scale, we have to give people the technology at their fingertips and make it easy for them. Now, that will be everything that we've seen in terms of electric vehicle uptake and domestic chargers, for example, domestic solar panels. This all helps. The next challenge for us, of course, is on the heat pump front. If heat pumps were just stupidly cheap, we'd all be doing it now. The thing that's holding us back is the cost, and of course, we need to invest in everything else to make that happen. But those are the things that will allow the consumer behaviour to change, and as we allow that to change, that actually feeds back to one of the questions we covered earlier about curtailment and constraints and electrical system behaviour. When you start to have that kind of flexibility and change consumer behaviour. But when you think about hydrogen in the industrial scale, for example, every single day we will talk to several industrial customers who, similar to Sam's just mentioned, they want to decarbonise, but they need a bit of help. Now, either they need help from policy levers and funding mechanisms that are yet to come, or maybe it's the whole carrot and stick approach, and actually they just need hit with a stick in terms of carbon taxes and COP26 outcomes, and it's all going to help. And I can't help but think, the next 12, 24 months is going to be a stupidly exciting place to be, because you're getting away from probably front movers now and early adopters in terms of decarbonisation to being socially unacceptable to not have CO2-free products, to have a 2030 corporate target, to move to science-based targets, for example. So actually it's going to be a race for market differentiation for people with products and services to show that they're on a trajectory. It'll be the first people to get that wee green star on the corner of their product that says CO2 free. It's going to be a really, really exciting couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to end, Barry, I think, in a kind of really uplifting message. And, we certainly are riding, a kind of wave of where it's less and less acceptable socially and for businesses to not make meaningful change. I think there's always a risk that if we don't bring industry with us, if we don't bring consumers with us, that that kind of groundswell of support that we have and kind of recognition of climate change, that we don't get that right. And so we've got the right conditions, I think, to encourage people to make a change. So I think with that, we've reached the end of our time. I just want to thank all of the panelists. You tackled just a brave selection of different questions and breadth and depth of topics. And thanks to the team at All Energy for hosting the webinar today, and hope that you can join some of the rest of the sessions today. Thank you all.